Well, good evening and welcome to the Wallace Collection Online. Tonight we present the first conversation in our new Swing Time series. In a moment, I'll hand you over to Dr. Yuriko Jackal, who will introduce tonight's guest. Please feel free to send questions through the Q&A tab at any point. We'll address these towards the end of tonight's talk. If you have any technical difficulties, do message me privately through chat and I'll do my best to help. Finally, a reminder that tonight's talk is being recorded and will be made available through the Wallace Collection YouTube channel. Yuriko, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We are so happy to launch this series of 5 evening talks devoted to the conservation and issues around the conservation of Fragonard's painting, The Swing, which many of you will know as one of the most iconic of our paintings and indeed of the French 18th century in general. To celebrate this project, we've invited 5 art practitioners and specialists to participate in a series of virtual conversations inspired by the key themes of The Swing: pink, identity, fashion, play, and the libertine. Tonight we have the first of our series, Pink, and I'm joined by painter Flora Jukanovic and curator and museum director Dr. Valerie Steele. Before I introduce my guests, I would like to thank our colleagues in the Learning Department at the Wallace Collection for their amazing support of this series. And most of all, my colleague Felix Zorzo, who's the acting curator of French Decorative Arts here, and with whom I've had many wonderful conversations about the continuing influence of the French Rococo. So to begin, our first guest is Flora Jukanovic, who has recently been taking London by storm with her rethinking of the Rococo in her art. Her large-scale paintings reimagine the dynamism of works by 18th century artists Tiepolo, François Boucher, and of course, Jean-Honoré Fragonard, through a filter of contemporary cultural references, including film, food, and consumerism. Flora completed her MA at the City and Guilds of London Art School in 2017. She has exhibited at Victoria Miro, where she is now represented, as well as the Gallery of the Central Bohemian region in the Czech Republic, the Jerwood Gallery Hastings, and at Leeds Arts University in the UK. This year she'll have a solo exhibition at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Congratulations, Flora. I'm showing here on this slide Flora's first work that she made in relation to The Swing. And I can definitely see the relationship, not just visually, but in the use of the term rougir, tu vas me faire rougir, or you are going to make me blush, in the title of your work. So it really feels that you're putting pink right at the heart of the story. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the color as we go along. We're also fortunate enough to be joined tonight by a world expert on the color pink, Dr. Valerie Steele. Valerie is the director and chief curator of the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, where she's organized more than 24 exhibitions since 1997, including The Corset, Fashioning the Body, Gothic, Dark Glamour, A Queer History of Fashion from the Closet to the Catwalk, and of course, Pink, the history of a punk, pretty, powerful color, the poster for which I'm also showing here on this slide. As author, curator, editor, and public intellectual, Valerie has been instrumental in creating the modern field of fashion studies and in raising awareness of the cultural significance of fashion. The kudos that she's racked up over the course of her career are immense and intimidating, so I'll just mention a few. She's appeared on many television programs, including The Oprah Winfrey Show and Undressed, The Story of Fashion. She's been described as one of fashion's brainiest women. She does, after all, have a PhD from Yale. And she was listed as one of the people shaping the global fashion industry in the Business of Fashion 500 from 2014 and the present. Welcome, Valerie. Welcome, Flora. We're so pleased to have you both with us tonight. So we thought we'd dive in with a question to Valerie. To set the stage for this talk, I've selected 3 very beautiful images from your recent catalog on pink. And I thought maybe you could use them to give us a very quick overview of the exhibition and the types of themes that you hit. Obviously, they're quite separated in terms of time. So very interested to hear how you see pink as a sort of continuing thread through history.
I was tremendously influenced by the color historian Michel Pastoureau, and he made it very clear in a number of books that there's no transcultural truth to color perception, that human societies make color, they make its meaning, they define it, and we tend to forget this, I think, because there's so many careless popularizations that make you think that color has a particular meaning that's integral to it. But colors meant something quite different, in Tang Dynasty China and medieval Europe and today. So you see with the Tang Dynasty woman how pink dye from India was used both as a cosmetic and as a fashion dye. You see that it's worn by a man in the Middle Ages in France. And then you see with the big Women's March in 2017, how it was a protest color, protesting against Donald Trump's remark about grabbing women by the pussy. And so there it was very clearly a protest color and a color that was willing to anger people. So that one feminist said, sisters, hold back on the pink. It's a trivial color. It's frivolous. It shouldn't be something that you use for important and serious events. But other women were saying, yes, but it can be a powerful color.
And that's one of the themes that we'll be exploring further tonight. So we've structured tonight's conversation around 5 topics arising from both your exhibition and from Flora's work and from the swing itself. And we'll come to the swing at the end. And so those topics are the power of pink, the gendering of pink, pink as fetish, the duality of pink, and commercial pink. So let's dive right in with the 18th century. By the 18th century, pink had really exploded as a color and a concept. It's central to art and fashion, and Valerie will be telling us about this in a moment. But in many ways, I think that sort of importance of pink was due to the efforts of the painter François Boucher and his patron Madame de Pompadour. And we're showing 2 portraits of Boucher here of Madame de Pompadour, one of them in the Wallace collection. And to get started, we thought maybe it would be interesting to discuss the way in which Boucher uses pink in his works. I think there are a couple of ways to describe fashion, to talk about makeup and cosmetics, and in a sort of more technical way, the way in which he paints pink and his brushwork, I think, is quite interesting to think about. And I'm hoping that Flora will talk a little bit about this. So Valerie, here pink is used to describe fashion in the 18th century. Maybe you could say a little bit about the use of pink in fashion at this point.
Pink became the ultimate fashionable color in the 18th century for 3 reasons, really. One, technical. There was a new variant of the Brazilium dye, which began to be imported from Brazil. It gave its name to an entire huge country. And the pink was richer and more longer lasting than the variant of Brazilium that was coming from India and Sumatra. So suddenly you had a newer, better pink dye. Then you also had the culture of fashion in Paris and Versailles, which put a tremendous emphasis on fashion and novelty. I mean, it was said of the French that they invented a new fashion every day. And so this color became in fashion. And then Madame de Pompadour, as a leader of the arts, helped promote pink as a color, as did one of her favorite painters, Boucher.
Are these new dyes being used in the dresses that we're showing here?
Almost certainly, yes.
Okay, these are really beautiful. And then, yes, here's another portrait of Madame de Pompadour. She's sitting at her toilette table. This is a famous painting of her by François Boucher in the Fogg Museum in Harvard. And one thing that I find so interesting about this painting is that, of course, she's shown in the act of making herself up. And Boucher has sort of represented that with a touch of cosmetic on the tip of her brush. But of course, she's also kind of holding her brush in the pose of a painter almost. So we really have this sense of the connection between cosmetics and the paint and the material of the paint itself. And the other thing that I find really interesting about this work is the contrast in color that you see, because in Boucher's portrait, there's a sort of juxtaposition of a very deep blue with pink. And then in the Sèvres that I'm also showing here, there's this juxtaposition of pink with green, which, as I understand it, was a very fashionable color combination at this point. And interestingly, collected as much by male patrons, Sèvres, as by women. So clearly, we're not yet seeing the sort of gendering of pink that maybe we see further on.
Well, except you do in a way because of the cosmetics. That cosmetics, especially this kind of rouge, was associated with women, and it was very controversial. On the one hand, to blush naturally was seen as beautiful and innocent, but women who put on too much artificial color were seen as being so hardened that nothing would shock them. You know, you could practically pull out your penis in front of them and they wouldn't blush. And therefore they needed to put this false modesty by putting on makeup. So when she's putting on her own makeup, painting herself, it's a very ambiguous image.
Okay, that's actually a really interesting remark that I hadn't thought of, because I've always been more sort of drawn to the color contrasts or color juxtapositions that I see in this work, and thinking about that in relation to Fragonard is really interesting to me, because of course Fragonard was Boucher's pupil, and I think kind of learned a lot about the use of color from him. And so seeing works like his portrait of Madame de Pompadour, and then thinking of works like The Swing, where the juxtaposition of pink and green and blue becomes so important, is really exciting. But I hadn't thought about the ambiguity of this painting. Nonetheless, despite the fact that there is maybe already a sort of subtle gendering of pink, we do start to see, or there are images of men wearing pink.
Absolutely. Men and women wore pink, boys and girls wore pink. There was no sense that wearing pink clothes was in any way effeminate. That was simply elite fashionable dress.
Okay. And then of course, that is something that continues to the present day.
Whoa, time out. It doesn't continue. It's a complete break. These two images are completely different. Can you go back to Cameron, please?
Yes.
The picture of Louis XIV. He was wearing fashionable pink, really no gendering for clothes. Cameron is wearing pink mink at a fashion show after 150 years of feminization of pink. So it's very much a protest against that, saying on the contrary, pink is a very punk, radical, androgynous color that you have to be a real man can wear pink.
Yeah. And there's a real sort of, it almost kind of enhances the sense of masculinity in the picture of Cameron, that he's able to go to New York Fashion Week dressed like this. He also has a pink cell phone, which I
that's right.
enjoy. Okay, so I should also point out that, of course, in our huge paintings by Boucher, The Rising and Setting of the Sun, Apollo is shown wearing pink. And Apollo, of course, is the stand-in for Louis XV in both paintings. So I think already, you know, there's this kind of maybe claiming of the color pink as a masculine sort of, I mean, there's clearly, he's not afraid to be wearing it in these works. Although I would wonder if it's not more associated with a sense of aristocracy and a kind of, you know, there's a real sort of sense of maybe unlike today, there's a kind of privilege involved in wearing pink at this point.
Well, yes, because it was an expensive new dye, but
Right.
I think more clearly it's associated with sunrise and sunset having pinkish shades. And so to have the god of the sun wearing pink is making an allusion to that.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's a good point. And then of course, these are works where going back to the sort of representation of Madame de Pompadour with cosmetics and the connection that's being made in Boucher's painting between cosmetics and paint, and the real sort of gestural quality of the way in which these works are made, this incredible brushwork. I think I'm wondering if there's also a connection that's being made starting in the 18th century between the sort of painterliness of the color pink and the way in which Boucher is handling it. And I wonder if that's something that Flora might be able to speak to, because I know that she thinks a lot about the use of pink in her own work, particularly here.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the 18th century, you get these amazing this amazing focus on the touch of the brush and sort of people's signature touch. And I think Boucher has these kind of very beautiful jewel-like, almost contrived shapes that he's done so many times and with such ease. And I suppose that goes back a little bit to the idea of makeup and sort of artifice. But I think what's interesting about Boucher's work is that he really constructs the color in the paintings in a very specific way. It's very crisp. He mostly organizes it, or with the ones we just saw, the rising and the setting of the sun, it's very much like just this Prussian blue, this deep sea of the blue, and then with these clear spots of this very, very fleshy pink.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's something about him using the Prussian blue, shifting his use of pink or his use of flesh colors to an even more pink place, and it feels exaggerated and almost like it's like the peak of that legacy of painting the female naked figure as part of European painting. And so I like to use that in my work because when I'm looking at Boucher's work, there's this kind of lively use of paint, but I think that the figures are often quite static, even though they're very plump and iridescent, and the paint is beautiful. But I mean, this is the Rape of Europa, and she's very still. And so with my work, it's a lot about using the gesture and kind of the freedom of using my body in response to those paintings to try and unlock the objectification of the female form so that she can sort of become part of the essence in a way, rather than this looked at body.
Do you look at other, well, of course, I understand you look at other painters besides Boucher, and one of them is de Kooning. So again, what do you see as the sort of common thread, if you will, between these two artists?
Yeah, I think, well, de Kooning is sort of the epitome of painting about painting, I guess, because it's so sloppy and delicious. And I think I came to de Kooning first, and it was through him that I was able to access the Rococo, I think in a way that made me understand its layers that aren't just to do with kind of the more saccharine elements of it, but there's this amazing interplay between kind of the fleshiness and the rawness and the use of paint, and the way Fragonard kind of stretches the like veils of color across those thick fleshy marks. And it's so similar to that de Kooning painting. They both speak of what it is to live in a body and to have organs, and I don't know. But yeah.
Yeah, I love this juxtaposition. I'm so happy that you suggested it. I find it really beautiful and quite telling, actually, and a new way to see Fragonard.
Yeah, totally. Because I think this painting by Fragonard, I understood I understood the way that Fragonard uses the paint as a way to explain what he's painting through seeing the fleshiness of this. It was kind of my gateway into that.
Absolutely, beautiful. So one of the things that I learned from Valerie's book is that at the end of the 18th century, there's a real shift in how pink is seen. And Valerie, obviously, you're gonna come in and tell me that I'm misinterpreting this, but you know, I'm thinking of this, what I'm understanding is that this is a sort of democratization of the color, that it's sort of shifting from a very sort of aristocratic privileged use of pink. You mentioned that the dyes are very expensive, and there's sort of the color is being used for, if not clothing that's expensive, items like Sev that's very expensive, and then there's a shift to a kind of popularization so that everybody's able to acquire clothing in this color.
It's a little more complicated.
Okay.
If you look at the crinoline dress from the middle of the 19th century, you get chemical dyes. And that means that you get pinks which are brighter, but which are cheaper to produce. Instead of being an elite aristocratic color, it becomes a popular color that servants and other working class women wear. So there's a democratization of pink, but more generally, there's a feminization of color, of all kinds of light and bright colors, including pink and pale blue, because men are tracked into wearing black and gray and navy blue, so that color itself becomes feminized. And that goes on at the same time as you get the democratization of formerly expensive colors like pink and purple.
Okay, so
by the time you get up to the 1930s, if you go back to that Schiaparelli for a minute, you've gone through colors, a whole range of different pinks. You had, after the bright sort of vulgar pinks of the 1860s, by the 1890s, you have a fake 18th century paler pastels to try and look more aristocratic. And then Schiaparelli brings in what she calls the sort of shocking pink. That's the color she gives it. And she says it's not a Western pink. She says the pink of China and Peru. And explicitly at the time, her friends and colleagues said, well, that's a color that Black people wear. I'm not sure you want to bring that into fashion. And she says, no, but Black people can often be very stylish. So that this color and the boldness of it was seen as being very different from the kind of well-mannered haute bourgeois taste of the 1930s. In the West.
Okay. So then works like these, in which we have a little boy who is wearing pink, and then I understand this is a boy's jacket. Where would you situate these in this sort of arc that you were just describing of?
Well, this is really a separate issue. This is the issue of between the 1860s and then through the 1920s, you have people arguing about, is pink for boys or for girls? Or is blue for boys or for girls? And there's a tremendous amount of confusion. American manufacturers gender baby clothes because you can sell more, but about half the department stores are selling blue is for girls because it's the Virgin Mary, and pink is for boys because it's a diminutive of Marshall Red. And the other half of them are saying, no. Pink is a pretty sweet color. It's for girls, and blue is for boys. So nobody can make up their mind which is which at this point. And then if you go to the next picture, you'll see what I think is one of the determining factors. When Huntington Hartford bought these two 18th century pictures of children, Blue Boy by Gainsborough and Pinky, and a lot of people made the mistake of thinking, oh, look, this proves that 250 years ago, boys were wearing blue and girls were pink. Now, had he bought Gainsborough's Pink Boy, which you just saw, that might have all been different because there were tons of pictures of little girls wearing blue also. It simply wasn't gendered in the 18th century, but people thought it was, and this fed into a decision to arbitrarily say blue is for boys and pink is for girls. That's the key. It's arbitrary.
That is fascinating. And definitely we're getting pretty far away from, the god Apollo, Louis XV as the god Apollo wearing pink. And then I know that this issue of gendering is something that Flora you've thought quite a bit about, and I think played off of in your work. So I'm showing here an image called the Pinku House, which I think speaks to the sort of real kind of ironic popularity of pink in Japan. And then I'm also showing one of Flora's paintings. So Valerie, this was a work that you have in your book, the Nishiyama.
Yes. The Japanese have been obsessed with pink for 1,000 years. They had multiple colors for pink back when most Western countries had no colors for pink. All they could do was say light red. So, but what you see here is a Japanese woman artist who's using pinku, a Western color, a Western concept for a Western idea of hyper girliness, which is completely external to Japanese traditional culture, but which has become part of girl culture in Japan and is now open to artists and avant-garde fashion designers to explore.
Okay, and Flora, is this a work that you thought about as well when you were making your painting in the pink?
Yeah, because of that idea of it being about girl culture, and then also I feel like there's some Rococo motifs going on in a lot of her work. So for me, it kind of connects that third element. But my work was about bringing together as many different elements that felt like they were part of girl culture, like sort of huge bows and flowers, and bringing that into a space that was about the landscape and like fertility of the landscape and the kind of eroticism of the brushstroke in terms of the body. And I think of the idea of femininity as something constructed and dehumanizing. And so it's interesting for me, I think, when I'm making a painting to try and use the materiality of the paint, and especially the potential it has when it's pink and it feels fleshy, to kind of bring it back to something that's universal and about experiencing, being a body.
And the title, I know that we're going to talk about your fascinating play with titles, which I find simultaneously really thought-provoking and charming. And we'll be talking about that in more detail further on, but I just have to ask you about the title of this one because it is called In the Pink. Where does that come from?
Honestly, it was a bit of a desperate grasp, that one. Ask me about any of the other ones. Sometimes they come easily.
I think it works so well. It's perfect. And I was really interested to discover this project, the Pink and Blue Project, again from your book, Valerie. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about it, because I think it's such a fascinating concept. And I understand it's one that's quite extensive at this point.
It's really fascinating because it shows how after World War II, the American binary used for merchandising purposes of pink is for girl and blue is for boys spreads all over the world to countries where it had never existed. But I think with this binary, what's another thing important to remember is that the blue is for boys is just temporary. It doesn't stick to boys. Girls can wear blue too. The pink, though, has stuck much more clearly in a way that when things are associated with girls or women, they become sort of contaminating for men. And it takes a tremendous sense of movement for men to be able to reappropriate something that's been contaminated by its association with femininity.
Everything in the picture of this little girl with her pink things is very much, it's not just pink, but it's also incredibly sort of what you would think of as a girl's toy or object, or
very often, although not invariably, because you do have things like electric guitars for little girls that are bright pink, and bicycles that are bright pink, that are not associated with, you know, like little sewing machines or little washer dryers and teacups that are girly. It's like everything becomes pink. Partly this reemerged in the 80s in a big way because it was a great way to have niche marketing. You know, little girls and sometimes, you know, some young adolescent women really like to push hyper femininity. The little girls, obviously, because they were sort of figuring out, I am a girl, girls must do this kind of thing. Later, they kind of drop it usually.
Right, okay. Yeah, it's, and also, of course, the connection with her being a ballerina, which is, you know, quite sort of inherently gendered. And then one thing that I was really interested to read about as I was reading up on this artist is that she said that as girls get older, their tastes change and they move away from pink and they tend to move towards purple, which I thought was so sort of interesting because initially, I think purple, according to her project and her observations, she saw purple as sort of coded a more boys color along with blue. So she sees this sort of evolution in terms of the girl's taste, but then the association with the color code remains, you know, always. And they're sort of, I think, always kind of inherently marked by that, even as their, you know, actual personal tastes are starting to evolve. So it just, you know, sort of goes to show how ingrained this dichotomy of pink and blue, and pink for girls and blue for boys, is in all of us. The other sort of really interesting use of pink that I read about in your book, Valerie, is the idea of pink as a fetish color, which of course I think, you know, we all sort of know, but you really crystallized it with the idea of the association of pink with body parts. And
not just with body parts, with pink parts.
Pink
I
parts.
think when we keep using the word flesh, it's a bit problematic, even potentially racist, because we're talking about a history of white people sort of fetishizing pale white and skin with pink blush on it. But pink parts of the body, lips, tongues, nipples, penises, vaginas, those are pink cross-racially. And it's these pink parts of the body which sort of become associated really with sexuality. Here, of course, with the Paul Poiret brassiere, and then with the Elsa Schiaparelli shoe hat with its phallic pink heel. But even the little shoe in the swing, the Freudian sexual symbolism, the shoe can be either coded as phallic or vaginal. I mean, the phallic foot can slip in the vaginal shoe, or the shoe itself, particularly its heel or its pointed toe, can seem to be phallic. So that it's sliding off like that is a very erotic image because of that kind of association.
Absolutely. And of course, in the 18th century, it's not just showing the shoe, which is flying across the canvas, but also having her ankle and her foot as a result bare. And we don't have an image of it on the screen, but of course, in the painting, you can also see very clearly that the other shoe is just about to drop. So she's sort of losing both. You cited a really lovely quote by Théophile Gautier, published in 1850, an ode to a pink dress, which maybe, if you don't mind, I'd like to just quote, because I found it beautiful. And also I think it really kind of speaks to this idea of pink as the sort of the association with the, not just the skin, but as you say, with the hidden parts of the body. So he says, "How I love you in that dress that undresses you so well. This strange dress, which seems made of your flesh, living thread, which mixes its pale pink with your skin." And then further along, he says, "And these pink folds are the lips of my unquenched desires," which of course is incredibly, you know, strongly sexual, I think, in the imagery. And I think, yeah, speaks perfectly to what we're saying here, as does this magnificent work by Flora. So this is it's a triptych.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. And you've included, I see just here, a little pink shoe.
Yeah, I think that Fragonard's painting without the pink shoe it sort of wouldn't work. It has everything of the painting is just held there, and it's iconic. So I guess it was my way of bringing that access point that was really easily understood. The painting itself is actually based on the swing turned sideways and sort of made into a mirror image of her dress. And I wanted it to be about opening and blooming. I think pink has, well, like Valerie was saying, it's the color of sunset and sunrise, and it's the color of cherry blossom, and it has this kind of potential, and there's something sort of erotically charged about that, I think. And then the trees are from Fragonard's amazing cycle, progressive love in the Frick. And I just think that they're just so massive and outsized and so abundant that it kind of adds to that sense of like promise and yeah.
And the sort of the mass of pink that you have in the central canvas, as I'm looking at it, I think, you know, I see so many things. I think it sort of reminds me of a rose. And of course, you know, there are those flowers in the swing itself, but also a peach. You know, I can see sort of the folds of someone's flesh. So I think on every level, it reads as something, you made this dress, this pink, you know, sort of central point to the swing as this incredibly sort of organic form that I think, you know, sort of is really inviting the viewer in the center of this canvas.
Yeah, thank you. I like that sense of things being abstracted and sitting somewhere between, so that the viewer can kind of work out what it is, or it dissolves in and out, and always being in the sense of, always having that sense of becoming and being about to form or about to fall apart maybe.
I like also how you put the shoe on the canvas on the left, so you have that sense of the kind of fragmentation, which I think also really aligns with the idea of pink as fetish, as you know, we've been saying, because it's sort of separated out from the main in a way that I find quite interesting. So, Valerie, this is a work that I've seen you talk about. Maybe would you tell us a little bit about it? I think it's beautiful, this photograph.
Well, Iraqi is, of course, a very, very sexual photographer. And with the watermelon split open like that, it seems to be making fairly graphic depiction of correspondence to female genitals. And then also that she's eating it. So again, sort of oral pleasure. And it's being a fruit, it's related to flowers, which nobody studies botany anymore, but flowers are the sex organs of plants. And then fruit is what emerges after they've been fertilized and is sweet. And so again, has all of these kind of sexual associations, which he plays with in this image.
And food is something that you think about as well, and the sort of relationship between sweet food and the female body. Is that right, Flora?
Yeah, I think, I mean, especially with pink, because it has those sweet connotations. And then and I think also in relation to the Rococo being this time of like great consumerism and and the way the paint is used in the Rococo is so sumptuous and kind of delicious in itself. It just, the whole thing seems to emanate like eating and food to me. But this one's based on a fête champêtre by Pater, and it's like a classic scene of women getting undressed, ready to bathe, and they have like sort of a circle of men around them who are all trying to kind of seduce them, and they're all half in the shadow, and the women are all wearing shirts that they're taking off their white shirts or their pink dresses, and they look like strawberries and cream or something, and the men look like predators. So I thought it would be fun to kind of take the men out and kind of exaggerate that sense of playful, like ice cream sundae kind of idea, and kind of merge it all together.
Yeah, I love that.
Well, and like Talleyrand's statement about no one can know the sweetness of life who didn't know life before the revolution.
That's a great quote. So to finish our section on pink as fetish, obviously this is probably one of the most well-known uses of pink in recent times, with Jean-Paul Gaultier's corset from Madonna. Was he modeling it on the corset from the museum at FIT, Valerie?
No, he modeled it from his grandmother's corsets that he wore, and he was obsessed with watching her undress when he was a child. When he was 6, he made a little corset for his teddy bear. Okay. Yes, I mean, it's again about its underclothes as being, in this case, the color, the exposed color of, Caucasian flesh, and but also the idea that colored satin corsets, Manet described as being like the modern nude, that they were more erotic than the naked body. They weren't respectable white satin. They could be blue, like in Nana, or pink, or red, or black. They could be other colors which would seem more artificial and therefore more exciting.
Mm-hmm. And actually, that's I think you're touching on an ambiguity that we were thinking about and talking about in relation to these images, because of course, as you say, pink being the color of lingerie, and then being worn in these interior spaces, I think is, there's something kind of quite interesting about that. It's not just erotic, it's also very ambiguous about, sort of what's happening exactly and what people are doing in these clothes.
Well, you can think of all the different names for different shades of pink. I mean, baby pink, blush pink, lingerie pink, bordello pink, shocking pink, hot pink. There are many different associations that you can have. And some of that plays out in, everything from the Venus ball gown to an at-home dress, a kind of dressing gown, which is very intimate clothing that would only be seen by an intimate associate.
Okay, yeah, exactly. And I think that that's also in the central image, the Paxton painting. Of course, on the surface, it seems quite innocuous. It's two women, but then there's this one woman who's handing the other a necklace, and she's looking maybe a little bit like she has some misgivings. And the woman in the center, who happens to be wearing pink, is sort of lounging back and looking a little bit, I don't know how she looks. I mean, it's sort of, I think, up to the viewer to decide, but there's definitely, you start to pick up on a sense of kind of ambivalence and ambiguity around the representation of this color.
Well, and the fact that she's wearing a Chinese silk top in a different shade of pink, again, is the sort of exotic erotic, which was very much a part of clothing, interior clothing at that time.
At the same time, even as there's a sense of kind of ambiguity, I think that there's also a strong association between pink and nature, first of all, as we see in the Charles James evening dress. But then also, of course, we mentioned the trope of the ballerina and ballerina pink in relation to little girls, but here it's coming back and being used to sort of, be the face of the Modern Muse fragrance campaign by Estee Lauder.
And actually, for many ballerinas of color, it's now become an issue. Why should they have to be wearing this artificially pink tights and shoes rather than those which are perhaps more aligned to the color of their skin?
Of course, yeah, because historically, I think that the color that ballerinas wear has been about skin, and that skin color has been Caucasian.
An exaggeration of Caucasian female skin color. Yes, very much so.
So there's this sort of, because of that sort of historical trope, I guess, when we think of ballerinas, we tend to think of them as quite innocent and sort of fresh. So there's this sort of duality, obviously, that needs to be rewritten insofar as bringing more representation into the world of ballet is concerned, but this kind of duality in terms of innocence, and then, this sort of women who are lounging around in these silk pink negligees, essentially. And that's something that Flora actually raised in conjunction with Tiepolo. And I think that, again, underlines the idea of the duality of pink in a really interesting way. Because, of course, in reference to Tiepolo, there's this idea of Tiepolo pink, which is a color that is worn by, among others, Odette de Crécy, who's the famous courtesan in Proust, where she's described as wearing Tiepolo pink indoors, and the sort of there. So again, there's this sort of connection being made with the idea of the courtesan and a specific type of clothing. Yet at the same time, it's being used to decorate this enormous ceiling painting that's, for essentially a public space, public painting. It's huge, it's grandiose. So I think there we have another sort of interesting juxtaposition between the idea of the intimate and the domestic, and then, this sort of very kind of sublime, if you will, space. And I just love to hear Flora's thoughts on that, because I know that she has been influenced by Tiepolo in her own work.
Yeah, I think Tiepolo sums up that kind of ambivalence as well, in that he is making these huge masterpieces, and I think that the fresco you just showed is the biggest fresco in the world. But I think there's still, because of the association with pink, and because he painted them so quickly and effortlessly, because he was, didn't fit what people thought of as an artistic genius. I think there's still this sense of him being described with words like charming and decorative. It's like he's sort of brought back down again in a way. And yeah, I was really lucky to be able to spend some time in Venice on a residency with Victoria Miro, looking at his paintings and kind of moving around under them. And I think there's something about them being these huge kind of escapist expanses, and him using pink for that. And I think pink has this this kind of unique transporting ability, in that you kind of think of La Vie en Rose and rose tinted glasses, or like seeing pink elephants, and it's got this sort of nostalgic nowhere place kind of attached to it that I think adds to the elements of fantasy that exist in his works already. But I think my experience of his work was not that it was not decorative at all. I think it's in the same way that someone like Franz Klein stands in front of the painting and you can see his body move around the canvas. Tiepolo is like kind of guides the viewer around underneath the ceiling in a way that's almost quite forceful. Actually, he kind of like dances you like the red slippers in that story. And that's kind of what these works were about, kind of taking that movement and trying to get it on canvas.
At some point, I want to talk to you about the how you see the difference between the French Rococo and the Italian, Fragonard Tiepolo. But for the moment, since we're getting a little pressed for time, let's move on. But I want to have that conversation very soon. Tiepolo, I think, is a really interesting way to segue into our final section, which is on commercial pink, because he was, of course, this immensely commercially successful artist. And I think, the sort of fantasy, humor, escapism that you're talking about as your response to him, Flora, is, I think, quite relevant to some of the images that we're going to be showing now, to do with the sort of consumerist attitude towards pink. Because of course, pink is the color that I think is really associated with consumer culture, with Barbie, lipstick, nail polish. This is something that maybe started being really articulated in the 1950s and 1960s. There's, of course, the very famous scene in Funny Face, where the magazine editor tells her staff that they're going to launch a campaign for pink, think pink, banish the beige, I think, forget the black. And then that magazine editor, from what I understand, was modeled on Diana Vreeland, who went on to make her own campaign for pink in the 1963 issue of Vogue. Have I gotten that right, Valerie?
Yes. I mean, the 50s and 60s were very much about girly, hyper-feminine pink, in line with the feminine mystique of the era. There's a funny line in Funny Face where, she has all the other women wearing pink. And then one of the girls in the office says to her, "But Miss Silk, you're not wearing pink." And she goes, "Oh, I wouldn't dream of it." She's a power woman. She's not going to be wearing pink. But as the decades go on, you find other people, Sugar Ray Robinson wears pink. Elvis Presley has a pink Cadillac.
Yeah.
You start finding pink being seen as the only true rock and roll color associated with punks and so on. So the 70s are not a pink decade, but it's the decade that Barbie goes hot pink. Prior to that, Barbie was wearing fashionable Dior-like clothes. And suddenly she's dressed in this trashy, vulgar, bright pink, which appeals to little girls. And it's this whole transition that it's like the plastic cheap toy, like bubblegum and Barbie, that has, again, this very vulgar, childish image, which is so different from some of the other more illustrious uses of pink in high fashion.
Absolutely, yeah. It's and then so Flora, what is your experience of sort of, because I know that this is something that you think about quite a bit in your work, the kind of identity of pink, if you will, and how you play off of that, I think is something really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this one is about the cheap, trashy toys that Valerie was mentioning. And this came out of going into, so the Disney store is really close to the Wallace collection. Mm-hmm. And I used to stop in there and then go to the Wallace collection. And the similarities and the overlaps between the pink side of the Disney store and the Wallace collection just kind of tickled me. And so this was about trying to isolate some of those overlaps with like the ponies and the feathers and the kind of mermaid-like characters and create this kind of compression of time and sort of explode it in a way, I guess.
Yeah. And the title here, I think, is quite interesting.
Yeah, the title is from Mean Girls. And I guess...
when it wear pink.
Yeah, iconic. I guess when it came out, it was like you sort of on the out. You felt like you were on the outside looking in at the plastics, and Katie Heron was wearing like a boy's pink shirt to fit in, but to sort of show that she was still a good person because she wasn't quite hyper feminine yet.
Right.
But I feel like over the years it's become adopted, and people kind of, you know, it's sort of you want to raise that banner with pride, I think. So I don't know. I love the film. I grew up with it, and it feels important.
It's a good film. I found this article in The Guardian, and I really I appreciated it because she wrote it on a Wednesday, and of course, you know, the idea is so it was perfect. And of course, this picture with poor Lindsay Lohan looking really as if she borrowed the shirt from her father, or something, you know, in order to have something to wear. I thought it was perfect. Now here's another, you know, sort of recent commercial use of pink with Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette, where she's not just making reference to pink and the kind of consumerism surrounding Marie Antoinette, but of course also really trying to juxtapose a very kind of modern pink, I would say, with this, you know, 18th century queen, to make the point that she is also a teenage girl, you know, kind of evolving in Versailles.
Teen queen.
Yeah, that was what this work that I made was about completely. I think it's just such an obvious color. You can't not connect it to that Barbie pink. And then I think there's something about Marie Antoinette and Barbie that's sort of maybe a bit alike. Barbie is there and you have to buy all her accessories and her Jeep and her like Malibu beach house. And there's something about sort of the characters of the Fête Galante and sort of what they had to do and what they filled their time with that is kind of a funny overlap. But I love that movie. I love the I've Got Candy scene where she's
with the shoes,
like gambling, eating cake, shopping loads. And I think it feels a bit like an influencer's Instagram story with like all those bits. And so I love that idea of taking the pink of that hyper consumerist Barbie, like present day pink, and trying to take it back to the Rococo period and kind of drawing that parallel the same way that Sofia Coppola does.
And then finally, we have the idea of pink and the sort of avant-garde fashion. And I think a real kind of circling back almost to the 18th century, because the ways in which pink are being used in this very subversive way in the Rei Kawakubo's line 18th century punk is to emulate 18th century silhouettes, but obviously with a real twist, and then to use the color pink, but maybe as it would never have been used in the 18th century. And I wonder if you would just comment on that, Valerie.
Yes, well, the idea of calling it 18th century punk is so brilliant because she's doing, in a way, what a lot of Japanese girls and Japanese artists do, the fascination with imagery of Marie Antoinette and Rococo. If you go to, Takarazuka, the cross-dressing theatrical troupe, they're all about Marie Antoinette in Paris. And here you have a very sophisticated fashion designer, looks back at Vivienne Westwood and the punks in London, looks back even further to the 18th century. This dress, instead of great panniers, it has huge shoulder pads. It's all made out of this bubblegum pink pleather. I mean, it's fake leather. It's so not 18th century, and yet it's glorying in the artificiality of the pink and of the silhouette in a way which is ironically very 18th century.
Mhm. Yeah, it really is. So we are out of time, and I want to open up to questions and have a little time for questions. But I have one question for both of you before we wrap up this portion of the evening, which is to ask you both, you know, sort of based on what we've been talking about, and obviously you both thought a lot about the use of pink in various ways in your own work. You know, I'm just very curious to know what you think of this girl in this beautiful pink dress on this swing, you know, with her shoe flying. How do you interpret her? What do you think is her status? What kind of control does she have in this painting, if any? I'm dying to know what you think. So maybe I'll start with Flora, if that's okay.
I think that she is in control, and that's one of the reasons I love this painting. I think she's in control, she's complicit in it, and she's having a really good time. And seeing it up close after it's been restored, you can see her face takes on even more agency, because you've sort of uncovered some of the like details of it. And I think it's a playful image, and it seems unusual to see a woman so empowered in that kind of situation in those paintings.
Mm-hmm. And Valerie, what do you think of the painting?
Who was the painting done for? Did it have a client?
So that is one of the great mysteries, and one that I hope to solve at some point, but have not yet. We know that it was painted for an unnamed gentleman of the court who wanted Fragonard to show his mistress on a swing, but we don't know who he was, and we don't know anything more about where the painting was placed in this person's house. And indeed, you know, it may be an apocryphal story, although it is the one that we go off of.
Well, I mean, it certainly looks like an artifact of libertine culture, in which case the image of the woman would be playing to a male fantasy rather than, much as we might like to project back onto it, the image of a woman with agency.
Mm.
This doesn't mean that women didn't have agency then. It's just that within libertine culture and within male sexual fantasies, images of powerful, sexy women are, according to psychoanalysts, the most popular male fantasy. So that's a very interesting phenomenon.
And that sounds like something that you must be thinking about right now with your upcoming exhibition, and maybe you'll be addressing some of these issues you know, still to come, but we'll all stay tuned for that, because Valerie's doing an exhibition on, may I say it?
Yes, of course.
Fashion and psychoanalysis. So yes, we're very much looking forward to that. Okay, I want to invite people to send their questions through the chat, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and take a look at the chat and see. People feel free to send questions unless they've sent them directly to Andrew, in which case, Andrew, let me know. Okay, my first question is from Tasha Marks. What do you think pink smells like? If pink had a scent, what would that be to you? Or what might it smell like in the 18th century versus now? Okay. Who wants to take that? Valerie, maybe. That sounds
well,
like
to the extent that pink is associated with sweetness, I guess it could be conceived of as smelling sugary. The 18th century was such a sort of pissoir of unpleasant odors, poorly masked by perfume. It's a little bit hard to imagine it smelling like anything more than not very clean bodies, I'm afraid.
Okay. Of course, we do have the association between pink and food, so maybe we stay with that and think about sweet foods rather than, as you say, it's true, the 18th century may not have smelled as we would like it to smell. Okay, I have another question. How do you think pink will be seen or perceived by the next generation?
Well, we know that the latest generation, as of about 2016 to 20, was really into millennial pink, which they saw as being cool and androgynous. And even when it was a color which was pastel-y, but with a little bit of yellow in it as well. I think that increasingly protest pink and queer pink and men wearing pink have had an impact on this long history of sort of Trisha Nixon sweet girly pink, making it more complicated.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I have a question for Flora, which is, I'm interested in Flora's point of view of the differences between Fragonard and Tiepolo, which...
Is that your question, Yurika?
No, it's not, but someone read my mind.
Well, it was something that I was really, I found it really difficult to understand that they were from the same time period, because apart from the color pink, there's not much that seems to immediately tie them together. But I think where Fragonard uses the brush in this playful way, and he has this kind of like jaunty use of mark making, and he kind of layers it all up and gets the kind of the hedonism of the time in the surface of the paint. I think Tiepolo does it in the way he choreographs the paintings and the movement through. I think they all have this sense of playfulness, but one is in the surface and one is in the space, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I have a follow-up question for you, which actually is the question about scent. Someone is interested in knowing what Flora's answer might be to the scent question, which I think is, yeah.
Okay, I was thinking like a rose-flavored sugar mouse. I don't know, just like super cute and like sweet.
I love that. Andrew, my colleague, head of learning, is organizing an olfactory event as part of the run of Fragonard programming. So to all of those who feel that we haven't successfully answered that question, either with body odor or pink sugar mouse, do come along and see what other scents might be. Okay. I have another question to both of you. What are each of your favorite appearances of pink in painting or pop culture? It's a tough one. Trying to think what well, I guess I have to say The Swing is mine. But
The Swing is mine.
Well, in art, I really love the image that I used on the cover of my pink book, which is a photograph by Nick Knight of a John Galliano model, where there's powder, bright pink powder coming all off the woman and her dress. And so it sort of ties together fashion and makeup. That's when I saw that in his studio, I was like, please, please, please let me use that for the cover of my book.
That's to those of you who don't know it, this is it. And it is beautiful. And I think I hadn't realized that it was powder, but it goes so perfectly with what we were saying, this idea of cosmetics and the really strong relationship between cosmetics and pink and paint and painterliness. Well, I think actually that's a great question on which to end. And I see that we're out of time. So I want to thank you both so much for your time this evening. That was such an insightful discussion. I think really interesting, wonderful for me, and I think all of our audiences to get to learn about both of you and your work and your perspectives on the Rococo, Fragonard, and of course the color pink. So thank you both so much. And to those of you who enjoyed this, do tune in. Our next talk in this series will be on November 22nd. You can learn more on our website. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a great evening.
Ciao.